We begin Holy Week, of course, as we always do, with this reading of the Passion, and also with readings to help us understand what happened. And I've found myself this week thinking a little more deeply about the Passion itself. What actually saved us? Like, where was the moment of redemption for us? And what I don't want this to be an academic thing where I point out one point and then, we kind of play it against another. The true answer that we would give is the whole action was part of our redemption. But I found it worthwhile to think about this question. Like, what saved us? And most people, I think, would probably say Jesus' death. Because we talk about it all the time, Jesus' sacrifice, But I found myself wondering about that because of this from the Psalms. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. Holocaust and sin offerings you took no delight in. Then I said, as is written of me in the book, I have come to do your will, O God. I found myself thinking much earlier in the Passion account. And it seems to me the pivotal moment of the Passion is Jesus' prayer in the garden. Not my will, but yours be done. And I think this for a couple of reasons. We say, for instance, that our fall came as a result of Adam's disobedience, right? Eve had a part in that, but ultimately theologians would say it was Adam's sin. It was Adam's disobedience. And if, in fact, our fall came about through the first Adam's disobedience, it makes sense that our redemption would come through the second Adam's obedience. Paul writes to the Romans, just as through the disobedience of one man, the many were made sinners, so through the obedience of one, the many will be made righteous. And so Adam, in effect, says, not your will, God, but mine. And Jesus overturns that with the opposite prayer. Not my will, God, but yours. And we see Jesus, I'll continue to say this in a minute, we see Jesus cooperating with this will of our redemption even before we can call him Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the divine Word. Agrees, as we heard in the second reading in that beautiful hymn from Philippians, to empty himself of the form of God. And he comes to earth, takes on a human nature. He's known to be of human estate, takes on the form of a slave. And you might hear that word slave as just a way to contrast with what he was. Like, what's the lowest thing we can think of compared with the highest thing we can think of? There's God up here, slave. But I think we should read more into that word. As Paul says, those who sin are slaves of sin. And so, literally, when Jesus took on our human nature, he took on everything, as we say, except for he didn't sin. He was like us in all things but sin. And so as slaves, we could not get out of our predicament. We could not undo what we did, even though it was our part to do it. Theologians have always agreed on that, It was human sin, and so a human being had to pay the price, so to speak. But why couldn't just one human being do it? Obviously not. We're just one. We don't speak, so to speak, for all, right? So the divine word comes down, takes on a human nature, and now can act for us. I think Jesus' human nature was not just so he could walk and talk and preach and heal, right? He didn't just need a vehicle to do these things. He took on our human nature so that he could act for us. And now what he does is undo our arrogance, our disobedience. He surrenders to God's will, right? And there's no other way to do it. It's the divine power, right? But it's the human nature. It's the human will. It's a free human will. And that's why Peter, for instance, when he says, there's no other name by which people can be saved, that's not Christian chauvinism. It's just the truth. Jesus was, we realize, the only one who could do this because he had divine power. At the same time, he had a free human will. And so it's to use the technical word, it's a theandric act. Theos, God, andros, human. It's the act of both Jesus' divine nature, his divine power, and his human nature, his human will, his free will given freely to God in surrender to God's will. And so, what comes of this then, it seems to me it has some implications for us. See, the divine will cannot act against the divine power cannot act against the divine will. Right? That's why when we are insisting on doing our will, we won't feel and be able to use divine power. That's why we get so stuck in our sin. But the act of surrender to God, God, take my life, I'll do what you will, then that opens up the divine power that can work within us, and in our lives. And what we seek, of course, is that. And we see Jesus not just then doing something, but as a model for us. And what it becomes is really our Paschal mystery. That word Paschal means the Passover. And first it meant, of course, the angel passing over the homes of those Jews who had marked their lintels with the blood. And then referred, of course, passing from Egypt to freedom, from slavery to freedom through the Red Sea. Paschal mystery, we talk about it, Jesus passing from death to life. But this act of Jesus, this surrender to God's will, is truly a Passover. passing over from I to you, so to speak, from me to God. And one spiritual writer, Father Raniero Cantalamessa, it's a beautiful phrase for this. He calls it the fiat of our redemption. And so he makes a parallel. He says, just as the incarnation could not have happened without Mary's free cooperation, her surrender, let it be done to me according to your word. Right? So Jesus makes the same move. Not my will, but yours. And so it becomes the fiat of our redemption. And so I just invite you this weekend to think about this moment. Not to pass over, so to speak, the agony in the garden and just get to the passion, just the suffering or the crucifixion or whatever. To ponder what this moment means in the garden. When Jesus finally, when he says, not my will, but yours. Yes, it had to play out, and the sufferings he went through, crucifixion, the death, etc., all that is a logical following upon his prayer. But this prayer, I'm convinced, the more I think about it, is pivotal for our redemption. And so is meant not just for Jesus, but for us as well. That our Passover, our beginning truly to move from a life for ourselves to a life for God, will begin in the same way. Not my will, God, but yours be done. Then whatever happens, of course, becomes the cross for us. But know that we're walking in the footsteps of our Lord. That the prayer he made becomes our prayer. And so the act of passing over that he made can become our own Passover.